that IFSC is a not-for-profit organization working to advance diversion and composting of organics with a focus on food scraps. We foster the growth and sustainability of the composting industry through our work as connector, educator, creator of programs, and supporter of market expansion in Illinois. Sorry. Our members and partners represent a wide spectrum of stakeholders, including community and government organizations, businesses, schools, institutions, service providers, compost processors, and individuals. Please follow us on social media and check out our website to get connected. You know, this is a huge movement that is happening in Illinois, and on our social media, you will see all of the great news about this growing movement. I'm on a new computer today, excuse my fumbling. IFSC is your local compost coalition. The United States Composting Council, USCC, is a national composting authority. IFSC is the state committee of the National Council. So if you're not already members, we encourage our attendees today to join in the collaboration because it's your involvement and knowledge that makes our organization more effective. Please join us. We do want your involvement. Look under the membership tab on the IllinoisCompost.org website to read about the many benefits of membership and follow the easy process to join. It's been a really full week. We're at our final day here, so we've taken a full loop around the cycle. And I did just want to highlight, though I think it's somewhere else in the presentations as well, but we have this wonderful resource for using compost now. And I think someone's going to drop that into the chat for me, a link to that. But it's a great new resource just guiding people how to use the finished quality compost that is made. So today we have a panel of compost experts with us. So it's a Q&A bonanza today. Let's open up the discussion. And this is your chance for you all to ask your burning questions around the virtual table. So on behalf of the IFSC Board of Directors, our active committees, sorry, back to the right slide, and the planning committee for this online educational series, I thank you for attending, and a huge thank you to all of our speakers through the week and to our panel today for sharing all the great stories and presentations. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to take it away if that sounds good. Yes? This is Stephanie Katsaros. Hi. I am very excited to be here today and share not as much my knowledge, but the information and the knowledge and the expertise of the panel that we have. It's so amazing. I've been so inspired and really enriched by the series this week. You know, I kind of think I know a little bit about composting, but you're always learning more. And I feel like the diversity of stakeholders that we've had and the unique questions that have come up really help us see the awareness and the interest in composting. You know, composting is obviously not, you know, organics are not waste, and this isn't the waste industry. These are folks who care about soil and who care about people and care about food and where it all comes together. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of this, and I want to go ahead and make some introductions here. First, we have Ginny Black, who has served on the Compost Council's Research and Education Foundation Board of Trustees since 1995. She's a lifer. She has chaired the organization since 2014 and also served on the U.S. Composting Council's Board of Directors from 1995 to 2010. Additionally, Gina currently chairs the Minnesota Composting Council, the nonprofit founded in 2012, and that is the state chapter of the U.S. Composting Council. She works with composters, businesses, and the public sector to divert organic materials to compost facilities. I've known her name for at least 10 years. She is just a go-to in the industry, and we're so thankful to have her. Dr. Paul Walker is a trusted source in Illinois. He grew up on a diversified livestock and grain farm in Northern Illinois. He received his BS and MS degrees in animal husbandry from the University of Missouri and a PhD in ruminant nutrition from the U of I. For 33 years, he was a faculty member in the Department of Ag at Illinois State University, and his research was focused on ruminant nutrition, specializing in the use of alternative feedstuffs like distiller grains, corn gluten, soy hulls, and other work, including human food scraps. And he also pioneered the use of composting in Illinois. He owns and operates a small scale farm with his daughters and is recently retired from the university, but his consulting firm is focused on things that we're talking about and more. Erlene Howard with Collective Resource Compost is the founder and owner of the business. It's a food scrap hauling company based in Evanston, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Erlene began her company in 2010 when she saw the opportunity to make composting easier for everyone and to help recover the resources inherent in food scraps. Erlene is also on the board of the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition. Lastly, Mr. Murphy. Charlie Murphy is the owner of Midwest Compost LLC with operating locations in Elgin and West Chicago, Illinois. Midwest Compost owns and operates landscape waste transfer stations at both locations, as well as is a landscape mulch producer and wholesaler and reseller. And Charlie's also on the board of the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition and an active member of the National Waste and Recycling Association. So without further ado, I am excited to get into the Q&A. And as you know, from those of you who have participated already in earlier days this week, we received and went through several questions from the experts who were on the panels those days, but some of the questions rose to the top. So if we can stop hosting the slide or stop presenting the slides, let's get our speakers on spotlight here. And I'm gonna start with Ginny and ask you a question. As this is the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition hosting this event, and you've been such an innovator in Minnesota, I wonder what we might learn from Minnesota and the cities and the municipalities who have bought into composting, and sort of how did it happen in your state? What might we learn from? And as an Illinois Food Scrap Coalition, how might we help thrust that forward in Illinois? And you might be on mute, Ginny.
I am on mute. Thank you. I was intently thinking about what I should bring up. We, in the state of Minnesota, we passed a law in 1987 that was recycling, and it included composting. But for many years after that, and we really focused on the traditional stuff, the cans, bottles, paper, things, which is really how I got my start in this industry. But later on, as things evolved, we went into mixed municipal waste, pulling the organics out. That was a total disaster. We had 8 facilities, they're all closed, none exist anymore. They were closed by 1995. And it was obvious we had to go to source separated organics. And so I worked then for a regulatory agency or a state agency. It wasn't a regulatory agency at that time. That forwarded, that was it was our job to go out and forward these ideas and make them happen in the state of Minnesota. And that's pretty unusual. Usually folks like me were in a regulatory agency and they have a different kind of role than we did, but we were advocates. Eventually we started focusing in the early 2000s, about 2000, on organics. And our experience with mixed municipal waste really informed that effort, what we did not want to do again, and started working with a city west of the metro area and then Western Lakes Sanitary District up in Duluth. They were the first ones to really go into organics. And so we've had, public policy. We also had funding that was behind our efforts, which really helped. But because the law that was passed in '87 had a tax on the transportation and disposal of mixed municipal waste. And that was put in a fund for recycling. And so that really is how we got started. And there was a lot of work before that. A law got passed like 20 years with the League of Women Voters on recycling and stuff. It didn't come easy. So it's one of those that I was just on a thing with Portugal and Brazil the other day, and they said, how did you do it? And it's like, well, you just keep pounding away. That's how you do it. And it's not a really good answer, but it is the answer. So I don't know. Take from that what you will.
I love that. You know, you touched on policy, but you touched on regulatory agencies and their roles, but also the advocacy and the coalition building, League of Women Voters. You know, who is your coalition? You know, who could be your coalition, and really being creative around that, I think is valuable. You know, you mentioning policy makes me want to direct a question to Dr. Walker. Hi, Dr. Walker. You have played an important role in guiding and improving policy and regulation in Illinois related to permitted composting. I wonder, from your perspective, what additional policy reforms do you think would be, as Benjamin Crumstock would say, prudent and possible in order to safely and reasonably expand composting in Illinois?
Well, that's kind of a mixed question. And so obviously what I would say is somewhat our structure, our regulations differently, maybe more the Wisconsin model than the Illinois model. But that said, I will be the first to tell you that Illinois EPA, our regulatory agency for composting, those folks are easy to get along with. And the permits are not hard. The biggest problem we have in Illinois is local siting at the county and municipal level. Those folks have an entirely different attitude about composting than Illinois EPA. Illinois EPA is strictly based on what's the law and what's the science. At the local level, it's based on politics and who's your neighbor and who's not your neighbor. And so in Illinois, that's probably our biggest problem in terms of regulation. And we addressed that a few years ago, and I think about 2010 is when we got that legislation passed. If you're under 30,000 cubic yards total one-time capacity on your compost site, the compost facility is no longer considered a pollution control facility, just like landscape waste compost is strictly. And so that then avoids the local siting permitting process, but it doesn't get around zoning and other issues like that. And that's where the local municipalities and counties can control who gets a compost facility and who doesn't, is through zoning and some of those other types of local regulations.
Thank you. And you know, that really hits home. I mean, it hits right at the core, local siting and zoning really being an issue. I wonder if, Charlie, you know, being a composter yourself, you just have any thoughts based, you know, to either continue on or to speak to what Dr. Walker just mentioned.
I appreciate that. And Dr. Walker's right. I mean, the issue is the development of infrastructure in the marketplace as it falls under 172 or Senate Bill 172, which has your local siting criteria, which put a preference into the zoning, particularly is if it's under a 172 siting or process, zoning only is part of the process if it can't be in a residential, it has to be a distance from a residentially zoned or a dwelling location. Other than that, zoning doesn't apply, and you have to go through the local or a siting process, which is a lot more complicated and expensive than a zoning issue itself would be. Outside of that, the process becomes not only your local political climate, but it's also your local public process or public climate, is that nobody wants a compost site, a garbage site, anything that we do in their backyard. And as we develop these facilities, we would hope that we could get an understanding that we have a good operator to start with, but that they can operate within a municipal limit, a county limit, responsibly, and not have the perception that the public has, is that, you know, I'm going to have 3 eyes if I have one of these facilities next door to me or whatever. It tends to be to make it difficult to operate a business when you get too far out of the market, because you have components necessary for feedstock coming in as well as feedstock going out. So Dr. Walker's right. Our process for permitting these facilities is a challenge, and yet we have, for alternative technologies, we're still yet to assess what the final development rules for that is. So we need to work on that, and I think that as we are spending some time with the state and under the MAC, or the new review that we're doing for the state legislature, that we're addressing some of that under the infrastructure portion of that piece of legislation that we're working on, or support to the legislature.
Thank you. And I know John Lardner wrote in the chat, and we've heard a lot that the USCC is developing model ordinances for local use of compost, and will release them in the fall. I am not asking you all this question unless you know the answer. You know, I'm curious where the U.S. Composting Council or others with a national focus are in model ordinances regarding siting. And I don't know. And I think it's just kind of food for thought for a national question that I'm going to come back to. But I want to touch on the point of not in my backyard and ask you a question, Erlene. You are a hauler, you're not a compost operator, but I wonder how you're seeing the interest in composting growing on a community level, but also being that your company contracts and works with municipalities, you know, has public perception been an issue in, you know, gaining adoption of just even the service of composting in the cities you work with?
Yeah, thank you. So as far as the interest is definitely growing. I think part of the individual misperception is that the compost collection containers are going to draw rats, and that is simply not true. So, you know, once we get over that hurdle, there is a lot of interest within a lot of different communities. Obviously, the 3 municipalities that have signed up with franchise agreements with us, they're doing a lot of education about getting their particular towns involved with diverting their food scraps. But then we also have other communities, smaller ones like homeowners associations that, you know, once there's an advocate there, we go in and set up a whole neighborhood with a composting program. That's one of the great things that's going on. And, you know, we're really excited about the steps that Deerfield has taken with getting a yard cart food scrap container at every single family home. And then we're going to continue to work with the multi-unit buildings and the businesses in the Deerfield community. So we're really excited about that. We also had a huge amount of success with Park Ridge, and it was their Go Green group that basically caught the composting bug and went to town with spreading the green word about composting there. And, you know, we were looking to have less expensive options like what the homeowners association did in Deerfield with the neighbor totes, that you know, you set up 32-gallon totes in a common area and multiple families fill into them, or multi-unit buildings fill into them. So that's what we're seeing. And it really works so much better when the communities talk about the composting to get the word out of the importance of it.
Yeah, thank you. And that is good. You know, the Go Green groups, we've got, you know, hi Seema, we've got Go Green groups on the phone and who've been active in Illinois Food Scrap Coalition, Liz Kunkel, many others. It is amazing the value of a groundswell, you know, and so I think that, you know, how does that translate maybe back to policy even? And, you know, I guess maybe to go back to Dr. Walker really quick, to keep it in Illinois, you know, how do you believe organics diversion really advance without legislative commitment and policy, or before policy and legislation forces its hand? You know, and I guess I would just want to ask you that, and from your kind of scientific perspective, what role do community groups play in advancement?
So I'll address the first question first. A bright spot in the near future and long term is carbon credit. Now, carbon credits has yet to unfold as to how that's going to work in terms of who gets credit, who gets paid, and what's the value. But that said, compost as a soil amendment increases the ability of the soil to capture and hold carbon. That's a potential market then for composters. And that we need to work on the upcoming legislation or regulations revolved around carbon credits, so that compost gets recognized as a beneficial best management practice, and people are seeking out compost to put in their soil. That's one thing that in the future holds that is bright. The second thing I will say about market development is marketing is tough, and unfortunately for most landscapers and folks who get into composting, marketing is a full-time job for someone, and they often just don't have time for that. But if you're going to be successful in marketing, someone's going to be assigned to it, and someone's going to be active doing it. The second thing regarding marketability is compost quality. Compost is not compost, and unfortunately,
Yes.
far too many of our compost sites produce crap. It looks the same as high quality compost. It's just not, but it looks great, but it doesn't test great. And so that tends to be a problem. And so education of our composters will help. Part of the problem is far too many composters are relying on tipping fees as their primary income source, not the marketability of the compost. And therefore quality suffers in the meantime. And what affects quality the most is the technology that you utilize, which means equipment, which means capital expense. Therein tends to be a problem for a lot of people. Regarding this siting issue, it's interesting that within the last 30 days, I was contacted by a business who wanted to get started composting. They went out and bought a site, didn't check with anyone, and their site is not a good site for composting. And so they've already invested money in land purchased. They've already been given their first notice from the county that they have to cease operations and they can't operate. So those are kinds of things that we need to be cognizant of, but the future could be bright in terms of marketability. We're just going to have to be sure that people recognize the value of compost.
I mean, I just want to take a moment with that thought and open the floor if any of you guys want to add to it. Ginny, I hear you nodding along and raising her hand.
Yeah, so much there, so much there. Carbon markets is something we've been talking about in Minnesota and at the national level for a long time. And in fact, we tried to do that in early 2010, and that failed. The Bush administration wasn't going to have any part of it. I'm hopeful now that we might see something like that discussion at the federal level and really more importantly at the state levels, because the state level, when the states do it, it drives it up to the federal level. It just, that's the way this changes happen when it comes to recycling of anything. So, you know, we have to look at that ourselves and how we can get the people in office that will support our ideas, because they're critical at the local level, at a city council level, at a township level, at the state level, the county level, I mean, all levels of government. And that's something that we've had build, and several people have mentioned that they see it more and more support for that. You know, I hate to say this, but some of you ought to think about running for your city council or your township board, because that's the way the policy gets set and it builds up into the state level. And I served on the city council for 18 years, and I can totally attest to how successful you can be if you do that. But it's time consuming and it's hard. But carbon credits is really a big market, especially for farmers. They can use a vast majority of the compost and get paid to use it under a carbon credit system potentially. So it's a huge market out there for us. All of us have lots of farming in our states, and we can't even get into the market right now because it's viewed as an expense and it doesn't really help. And I still have to use fertilizer, and there's all kinds of things going on there. But in the quality of compost, I think our next Minnesota Compost Council legislative initiative is going to be getting a definition of composting in state statute or rule, whichever we have to go. I don't know. I'm gonna be talking with lobbyists for our regulatory agency about that as an initiative next year, because the crap compost that Dr. Walker talked about, it's out there and it's sold at cheaper prices than the good stuff. And so the ones who really make good compost, they have to really work hard to sell their stuff, because the lower quality stuff is not, they don't do PFRP, they don't do a lot of management of their stuff. And it oftentimes, I will challenge all of you this spring to go and buy bagged compost and see what you think of it compared to compost that comes from a facility that is really producing quality compost. There's hands down no comparison. And that's a problem too, because consumers see that and they think, oh, this is compost. It's got all these. I actually found raw manure in some of the stuff that I bought, sticks, stones. I mean, that leaves a very negative consumer impression.
Before I jump to Erlene, Ginny, I want to ask you, do you think that state standards would be adequate? I mean, do we need this to be nationally regulated?
It would be lovely if it were nationally regulated, but when you push it up to that level, it's so generic that sometimes you really need to do something at the state level that's more specific and tailored to the situation that you have in the state. But it could be, you know, a way to bring it down to the state. But I have generally experienced in this 40 years I've been doing recycling that it starts at the grassroots and it goes up. It doesn't come from the top and go down when you're talking about politics.
Can I jump in here? I have never been really in favor of compost standards, but compost standards are a good thing. The problem I have is how you write them. You have to write standards for high quality, medium quality, and folks, we got to have some low quality, because everything even the very best composter makes is not going to meet the high standard. So if you have standards, you have to have variable standards so that all the compost we produce can find a beneficial home somewhere. So making standards is a good thing. It's been tough to get people to understand how to do it right. Is that right, Ginny?
I would agree. And I don't think we're I don't think you want to enshrine standards necessarily in a law. I think that's the bad way to go. What you want to enshrine is a definite, what the heck is compost? They have to meet PFRP. You know, there's certain things you have to do to make sure it's safe and usable by people. But Dr. Walker is correct about the different types of grades, let's call them grades of compost. They're all over the map. But so you have to be careful what you actually put into a law and what is actually maybe comes from the definition into a standard kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that there's points of reference in terms of writing language that says you must have a standard, for example, without defining what that standard must be. And then also I think of recycling grades. And just like you said, Ginny, you know, if there's a market for a low grade, well, then let's create a low grade, or let's acknowledge that it exists, right? I mean, so I agree with you. I want to let Erlene have the floor before we change topics.
I just wanted to add that, you know, the marketing piece that Dr. Walker talked about is across the board. You know, it's not a field of dreams over here as the hauler that, you know, you just, show up with your orange bucket and everybody wants to put their food scraps in it. There needs to be, you know, we spend a fair amount of time on education to explain the environmental importance of diverting the food scraps. That's all I wanted to add.
No, thank you. And actually, what a great segue, because education is directly linked to contamination, which is directly linked to standards. And Charlie, I know on the IFSC board and over the last year, I've talked to you and heard a lot from you about contamination, thorn in the side of composters. And, you know, what do you think is the best way to combat this? I mean, there's obviously many, but what do you think are some actionable steps that could be taken in Illinois to really tackle contamination?
I think contamination is clearly one of the number one factor, certainly number one, I believe, in the advancement of the business. But it starts with the generator of the raw product before it comes to, just like recycling, you got to clean it up. It starts at a generator level, and you got to be responsible for what you put in your cart, what gets loaded into a collector's vehicle, and what gets delivered to a transfer station or to a compost site. You don't pick up the bucket, the container, the bag if it's got contamination in it that you can see. Now, we got plenty of people that'll hide their material from shredded paper, which is compostable, but it's also very messy. If you've got a lot of that, it blows around. It's a contaminant around the site. But from balls to rocks to stones to, you know, the things that we get more of, tennis shoes, we're not in it for a collection, but people seem to think that those are things that were in their yard at one time or are a waste. So it starts with the generator, and the contamination factor is critical in reducing what goes on from the cost of the operator at the compost site and their ability to sell a quality product. That becomes the highest standard of what gets criticized when their product's for sale, whether it's to a commercial bagging outfit or it's to the homeowner. I've had material that's been delivered to a homeowner who said, well, this is an organic material. I found a bit of plastic in it. And, you know, although that plastic is harmless, the fact that it was there portrays it as being not organic to someone, because plastic is not organic. But by nature, we probably will never have a perfect product that gets out on the street, but to get as close to that, it needs to be done with the reduction of the contamination. And it's only going to start with education of the consumer who's generating it and giving it to the hauler collecting it.
Well, you know, Erlene, thank you, Charlie. And Erlene, as a hauler, you know, I know you educate. I know what you and Mary Beth and Liz and the rest of your team, I know how important that is. You also can't control what they do, meaning you can't control what they put in, but what do you do as a hauler to control what you give to the facility. And you might be muted.
There you go.
There, now you can hear me. Okay, so, well, we do a lot with education and then also with the training of our crew that are on the front lines. And when we tip at Lake Shores Transfer Station at 31st in California, and they have a concrete pad. So we tip the material out, and, we pull out everything that that we see that is not compostable. So, I mean, to Charlie's point, like, what's buried. But I think, you get a good sense if a customer is struggling or if there needs to be more education. And when we have our regular education driver calls about every other week, and when we find a new thing for them to be paying attention to, or if they're finding like, all of a sudden there's more plastic bags, or, the bad lettuce is left in the package and put into the bucket, then we turn around and, besides pull it out, go back to talk to the customers. So we try to backtrack as much as we can. It's easier with the totes. With the totes, we, the 32-gallon totes, we peruse them before we pick them up. We open the lid and try and get a sense of what's going on before we put it on the truck, and then we label them. So when we're tipping them, then we know which producer we need to circle back around to. So, I mean, and it's almost nonstop, the information going out to the customers about, I mean, I feel kind of sorry for the ones that are doing it 100% correctly, and then, there's just the one-off situation. Oh, my son had a pizza party, and there was a bunch of high schoolers here, and they put, I didn't realize they put the pop cans in with the compost, but we were able to backtrack and say, what happened? And, she was just as surprised as we were.
Well, that you just pointed to, the feedback loop. And I think that we always need to ask and hear from, I guess, the next stakeholder in the value chain to know how's it going, how's what I'm giving you look, and understand kind of what the challenges are so I can improve my operations. I know that's always been, my haulers are my friends, and I say to the, generator I'm working with, the better we provide it to them, the more likelihood that they will recycle what we give them or compost what we give them, and the less likelihood they will just take it to the landfill because they don't trust us anymore, or they found one bad thing in one 30 yard and then they sent all 10 30 yards to the landfill, which happened to be broke my heart. Somebody's not muted and they're making a lot of noise. So take care of that. Thank you. So gonna move on from contamination, and I wonder, looking at how we move forward and how we grow infrastructure, and I'd like to talk about anaerobic digestion, and I'll start with you, Dr. Walker. If anaerobic digestion infrastructure were to expand, what do you see as the most important items to keep in mind in terms of geographic location? Does it need to be urban based? How do we connect the dots between the digestate that would be created and the use, where, in which, and how it would be used and transported? So where do you see to grow anaerobic digestion infrastructure? What needs to happen?
Well, probably for it to grow, the co-products of production need to have more value than they have now. Electricity generation from an anaerobic digester has very low value in Illinois. In some states, it has considerably more value, but in Illinois, it has low value. The methane, of course, has to be scrubbed and cleaned. it doesn't have very much value. Most of the folks that have digesters now are using the heat from them for some reason, and then they're burning off the methane or not worrying about the electricity. So the co-product generation is an important component to give it some value so it can be sustainable long time. I'm a fan of anaerobic digestion big time. We kind of, Illinois, we're in such a hurry to start promoting anaerobic digesters. We tried to get the regulation for siding and building them to be kind of with the compost, and it's a whole separate issue. Anaerobic digestion needs to have its own set of regs, its own issues by itself. It's just like when we started composting, the opinion influencers in Illinois said, well, we'll just use the landfill regulations for composting. Well, that was a big mistake for us for a long time. And so the same is true with anaerobic digestion. It's its own vehicle and its own use. The nice thing about anaerobic digestion, you can pretty much locate it anywhere. They're self-contained units. They tend to be low odor if managed correctly. The biggest problem with them is you're going to have biosolids and effluent. And what are you going to do with it when it's done? And while everybody tends to think that effluent and biosolids coming off an anaerobic digester don't smell bad, I'm going to tell you they still have odor, folks.
Yeah.
It's just not the pungent odor that swine manure might be, but it's still odor, and you still got to manage it and do something with it. Composting fits in behind an anaerobic digester very well to do something with the biosolids. The effluent is what really we have to find a home for and be able to incorporate somewhere. But I'm a real proponent long-term of anaerobic digestion. I just think we got to context it so that it's its own vehicle and its own use, separate from composting.
Can I ask Dr. Walker a question? Do you, most anaerobic digestion at this point is manures, commercial food processing facilities will take their waste, and it's a very uniform waste. And
Homogeneous.
yeah, very much. But when we're talking about curbside collection, I mean, just tagging on to our previous conversation, there's a lot of contaminants in there. And these facilities have to pump this stuff through different pipes and et cetera. And, you know, will it ever be, or is it now even appropriate for a source separated organics collection program?
Yes, I've seen some folks, they're very few, that when they get their material in, they screen it to make it a homogeneous product. We are able to do anaerobic digestion at a higher solids content today than we were 20 years ago, though both methods still exist, but there are higher solids anaerobic digesters. But maintaining something that's uniform, so it means you're going to be on a volume. You can't receive a truckload of grease today and dump it in and expect your anaerobic digestion to work. It's got to be 5% of the total every day, day in, day out. It can't suddenly be 35%. So yes, Ginny, you're exactly right on that. But I think that's all management and technology and can be handled. But again, high tech versus low tech. And just like composting, we think of composting as low tech, and it is, but we're finding today to make high quality compost, it's higher tech all the time. Yeah. And that's what some people just can't seem to get a handle around.
But I think the anaerobic digestion, one of the other handicaps to it is that it particularly isn't as scalable as you can with compost. You can't handle the volume. You need multiple AD facilities in order to handle a mass volume in a major marketplace. So the problem with that is cost. The operating of an anaerobic digestion versus compost is extremely higher. So you've got a bar, you've got a hurdle, you got to get over is the operating costs, the development costs, all that on AD versus finished compost markets. So there's a balance, and maybe that evolution comes, but there is a hurdle to be had when you look at the capital cost and the operating costs of that on a competitive basis. Now, we've got a wastewater treatment network of facilities across the marketplace that if just even the permitting process of those two to manage food scraps, today we aren't allowed to do. They could, as a complement with a little capital improvement, at least manage some of the food scrap that's out there today. They do have a contamination issue, no different than compost with the way their operation's set up. But I think if we're able to expand their ability to permit, their ability to accept some, you've got very local, every municipality's got their own wastewater treatment pretty much. So you've got quick access to sites like that. But there's several factors that are involved. And I think the operating expense and cost of an AD by itself and scalability are two big issues that have to be overcome.
Yeah, and pre-processing is, like a dirty word no one wants to talk about, but that's going to be needed depending on the material, or to Dr. Walker's point, improved technology. I mean, I know not enough about AD machines, but from what I've learned and attended on webinars, there's crazy machines that can kind of eat up anything, and but who's got the money for that? So it's interesting. We need the infrastructure. Before we move on to questions from the audience, I have a last question for you, Charlie, that kind of relates, it doesn't relate to anaerobic digestion because we're not talking today about transfer stations that would need to be worried about AD, but in general, if we're really going to grow organics recycling, do you think that the transfer station capacity we have is sufficient? And I don't just mean the number of facilities, but their capacity, ability to take food scraps across more transfer stations than do that now.
I think that there's a couple of things related to, ultimately a transfer station is no good unless he has a facility to take it to. So it's a combination of having an infrastructure being a transfer, because it's like Chicago went from a direct haul landfill market to a long haul landfill market. That's kind of where we are going to be with the compost business, because nothing will be developed in somebody's backyard. We're always going to have that route truck capable to haul it 10 to 15 miles to be efficient enough to get back on their route to continue to collect that material. Now, whether we talk about our co-collect programs, our ride-along programs where you're putting landscape waste and food scraps together in one truck and taking it to a transfer or compost site, it's an infrastructure question. We don't have the capacity today to handle, say, an outright ban of food scraps in our marketplace, because we have 48 compost sites, and I think 6 of them in the state that accept food scraps. Compost or transfer stations, there's only a handful of transfer stations that are accepting food scraps as a clean waste or a source separated material that ultimately gets landfilled or composted. So the answer is yes, more infrastructure is needed. We need more compost sites to either be expanded to handle the food scraps as a joint feedstock, or we need separate infrastructure to handle food scraps as an individual. Whether it's AD, whether it's compost facilities, whatever, we don't have the total infrastructure to handle an all-around ban. So we're dealing with that in the material advisory committee that is going on right now, talking about infrastructure and markets. So I think that technology will play into that, whether it's AD, advancement in the compost side, whether you're air circulated composting, or it's windrowed, or whatever your technology is that you're utilizing. That's all going to play a role in the expansion, but I think we have to do more to have additional capacity before we're going to be able to get to a certain point where it's going to be across the market successful.
Yeah, can I jump in on the ban thing? That is so interesting, because a lot of states are choosing to take that route, mainly on the East Coast. But here in Minnesota, what we did, because we couldn't get bans, our legislature just wouldn't have it, is we passed, the law that was passed says you must provide the opportunity to recycle. It does not require that you recycle. It does not ban material from a landfill. And then they set goals So for the traditional, it was 45%. And then a few years ago, for the 7-county metro area, the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all of its suburbs, they raised it to, I think it was 75%, 70 or 75%, I can't remember which.
75.
And you can't reach that unless you do organics recycling. So then there's a date established that, you know, by this time you have to do that. So we didn't take the ban approach. We just said, you have to provide the opportunity, and this is the goal you need to reach. And as I mentioned before, we have some state funding that goes with that, that allows that to happen a little bit. I mean, it by no means covers all the costs, but it's seed money, basically. So that's a different route. You might want to think about that. If that might be easier to do in your state, you might want to try that as opposed to banning.
Well, Ginny, and in the Minneapolis market, which I'm familiar with, is that you've got a tip fee that's a much higher base tip fee than what an
Yes.
Illinois marketplace as a landfill. So you've got an incineration marketplace with a high tip fee, ultimate incentive to do anything I can to reduce my tipping at an incinerator or a landfill. Illinois has a very artificially low landfill tip fee price. Even a combined transfer to landfill is cheaper than, say, what the true cost is in incineration. So, you know, the percentage, the more of the food scrap I can take out by weight gives me a lower tip fee. So
Right.
they're all
Yeah.
relative, you know, as to how that gets played, but that's why they go with a percentage. I think, you know, Illinois, we're looking at what's the next step in our percentage of recycling, and it still is going to be hard driver as a percentage of where we go and look at, because we've got a lower tip fee on the market. So it's a combination of that, and I think you know, those things have to be evaluated as you get on that road as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And we also have, we do tax actually the material by tonnage going into the facility. So we have different levels of taxes in various places. And that raises the sole function of that at the time, which is quite a while ago, was to raise the tip fee so that other technologies could compete with the land disposal. It doesn't really do that now, but that was the purpose of it. So you're right.
Well, they subsidized it so they could keep the waste in Minnesota under the direct haul, under the, because it was going out of state. When it was,
All
it
right,
opened up,
all right, all right.
you know,
I
well,
get
it's just
it.
the cost.
It's financial. This is a financial discussion, and this is a business. And you know, if composting business isn't viable, if it's not a way to grow revenue and make money, who's going to get in the composting business?
They aren't gonna.
And then what happens? So I totally hear you, Charlie. That's why it's always great to have you on the line, because you kind of ground us in the reality of being on that side. So thank you for that. I'm going to take questions from the audience. We have 5 minutes, which means that we might have time for like 2 questions, and then we're going to go from there. So I'm going to kind of bundle a question regarding compost use in carbon sequestration or carbon farming projects, and the potential to pay, you know, we talked about carbon credits before, but I'm going to say carbon credits or other incentives to get farmers, for example, or road construction projects, you know, public entities, farmers, public entities, or others. How do we get them to use compost? It's not happening in Illinois right now. So if I can ask Ginny and Dr. Walker to share your perspectives concisely, I greatly appreciate it.
Go ahead, Dr. Walker.
Well, I think we have to influence the government folks who are going to be helping establish the carbon credit or carbon sequestration rules, that compost plays a role. Right now, it's not recognized as playing a very large role in carbon sequestration. And if it's recognized that it does, then those companies in the private sector that are going to probably be the ones who drive the carbon credit market will then recognize as a best management practice the addition of compost. And if there's an incentive to use compost, suddenly there'll be a market for compost.
I think that's one part of it, but I think maybe a second part of it is I've been getting USDA announcements about various funding programs, and really very few of them mention compost. And I think we need to start working with our extension agents at the university level and talking with them about potential research projects and doing projects in the farming community so that they see directly, we put X number of tons on this field and we grew this and this was our yield, and and those kinds of measurements to not only convince them that they should use it for carbon credits, but that it actually is beneficial to them in growing. And so I think, there's always a multi-pronged approach to everything. I think that's one side of the issue as well as the other that Dr. Walker talked about.
Thank you. Charlie, you're on mute and we're running short, so be tight if you want to say.
Yeah, just quickly, I think you're also fighting big ag when you're doing that, the big chemical.
Yes.
Provide, they're telling their farmers, generational farmers, that this is what we've done forever, and to convert to this, you're not going to get the right balance and so on for their crops. So you scare a farmer in that regard, convert to an alternative, which could be just as beneficial depending on the demands that something has on their soil. But big ag is a big impediment to the compost business.
Got it. This is a 30-second question. What can be done with marijuana plants after they're harvested? Anyone have know about regulations in other states that are allowing composting of marijuana plants?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, me either. Okay, I didn't think so. Just wondering.
Other than smoking it, I guess. Well, I don't know what.
Hey, it's legal. I'll meet you there. Just kidding. Anyway, so I really do want to be respectful of everybody's time. We had some great questions that we didn't get to, but we will be happy to address those directly via email or share out when we provide a thank you to everyone who participated this week. The slides will be available, and the slides that we have that were related to today will include a culmination, or I should say a consolidation of take action steps that were provided by those speakers in previous days. So this will all be shared with you. There's a lot to think about how you can behave, as well as how you can, as a business, participate, how you can speak to your legislators. So we really want to thank all of our sustaining partners at the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition. None of this could happen without them. There's a great team, as Jen Jarlin already mentioned, who helped put this together. And it really comes down to there being interest in this topic and interest in moving this initiative forward in the state of Illinois and learning from our friends in other states. So there'll be recordings of the earlier days and this one on the IFSC YouTube channel. And again, on behalf of the speakers and the attendees and all of our partners, we just want to thank you for joining us, and keep on composting.
All right. No problem.
Sounds good. All right. Cheers, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for your work, Steph.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.